the electricity is already there. We're already building out plenty of new clean electricity, so the grid's getting cleaner and cleaner all the time. So you can get on with these things now. You don't have to wait for that carbon capture and clean hydrogen infrastructure to be put in place, which is still going to take the best part of the next 5 to 10 years.
Welcome back to Wicked Problems. I'm Richard Delavan, and another week. It's been quite something. We've had the carbon budget here in the UK, which seemed to be some good news. We had the Clean Industrial Plan in Europe, which also seemed to be pretty good news. But then we had the news from BP, which did not land quite as well, which maybe makes what Liam Hardy had to say slightly more justified.
Look, I'm a real greenie, right? I really want us to solve the climate crisis for many, many important reasons. And I really don't trust the fossil fuel industry to do it. And I'm very skeptical of anything that they put forward.
So sense making is what we try to do around here, rather than just sort of live action, live audio doom scrolling extension. And as I probably don't need to tell you, the last few weeks has been a little like drinking from a fire hose. So really taking a few days last week or so, just try to take it all in and kind of get some perspective, because that's hard to do right now. So on Wednesday, the UK's Climate Change Committee released the country's 7th carbon budget, which is basically their estimates about how the UK can get from where it is now to a net zero position by 2050. I love that approach, simply because it's like we're going to start with the objective and then we're going to work backwards to figure out how we get there across the entire economy, which I think still is unfortunately becoming even more rare at the moment, actually agreeing that there's a problem to be solved, then trying to do something about it. But I'm sure we'll get back there, probably. Hopefully. So last time the Climate Change Committee, or we'll just say the CCC from here on out, put out its carbon budget in 2020, it projected that getting to net zero would cost a net £400 billion, nearly $500 billion, or a bit more. The projections from this week, as Simon Evans at Carbon Brief noted, few in mainstream media have reported this, are 73% lower than they were in the last budget in 2020, which is insane. But the reasons are very clear, because people like you, climate tech, investment, policy, and renewables, have crushed the cost curve on those technologies and the other applications that are going to use them. Here is CCC boss Emma Pinchbeck.
Typical UK household will act on climate change, but not change their lives radically. They will have a warm home, drive a car, eat a healthy diet, and go on holiday. These choices contribute a third of the emissions reduction in 2040, and over 70% of that is just through heating and transport transitions. The efficiencies and falling costs of these technologies mean that by 2050, a typical household in the UK will save approximately £700 a year on both their energy and on their driving bills.
So Pinchbeck was also clear about the biggest obstacle to this. The price of electricity in the UK needs to come down.
The clean power transition is vital and must go beyond generating this low carbon energy to deliver a rapid rollout of the technologies that use it. It is also vital to make sure that electricity, the fuel of the future, is cheap. This is a critical assumption in our pathway.
In part, that means figuring out how to de-link electricity prices from the marginal cost of the most expensive energy in the mix, which is natural gas these days, driven by global market forces completely outside the control of people in the UK. And that's not just for households. Getting electricity prices down is also crucial for the future of industry in Europe, in the UK, and pretty much anywhere, as industry itself goes more electric, except for that last 5% we might have to do something else with. We spoke to Liam Hardy, head of research at Green Alliance, about some ideas they outline in a new paper about how to do exactly that in industry. We spoke before the carbon budget came out in the UK, but just after the results of the election in Germany, where electricity prices driven up and up as two big bets Germany made in energy did not pay off super well, getting rid of its nuclear fleet and ever greater reliance on cheap Russian gas that was supposed to be reliable, secure, and never interrupted. Markets got disrupted, and that has accelerated the increase in prices, which has then accelerated German industrial decline, And not surprisingly, that's been hardest hit in areas that saw a big rise in votes for the far-right AFD. The politics, the tech, the economics, the science, it's all connected. And getting it right here in the UK may be the difference between a more hopeful future and seeing some version of what we're seeing play out in the US, Germany, France, etc. Maybe playing out here. So, a couple of big news days. Wednesday was BOFO. We had that carbon budget being released. The EU dropped its new clean industrial plan. And we'll probably circle back on that one because there's just a lot to talk about there. And then BP, the company that 20 years ago said they were going beyond petroleum. As you've heard, that's kind of gone by the wayside. They seek to exit, scale back their renewables investment and park what they do have in JVs. They've already decided, and now focusing more on oil and gas. So that's exciting. Here's Murray Auchincloss on BP's capital market call on Wednesday.
In 2020, we made some bold strategic changes, accelerating into the energy transition while progressively reducing our hydrocarbon business. We then saw COVID, the war in Ukraine, a recession, and a shift in attitudes of markets and governments have a fundamental impact on the energy system. Pressure on budgets meant that lower cost energy won out in most nations, and the pace of transition and decarbonization, while important, was not as fast as envisioned. And energy demand continues to rise. Our optimism for a fast transition was misplaced, and we went too far, too fast.
And just like that, the promises of 2020 were binned. At the end, after our interview with Liam Brady, we'll play some other highlights, if that's the right word, from the BP investor call, where we also get a taste for how eager the company is to signal its fealty to the new regime in Washington in the most Orwellian way possible. But first, we also caught up with Charlie Mercer from the Startup Coalition, who is calling for climate tech CEOs in the UK to co-sign a letter asking government to prioritize the net zero innovation portfolio by showing the kinds of return on investment some of that public money could unlock. And we'll find out more from him. Finally, it's a tough and sometimes scary time. I have found it hard going and difficult to avoid the temptation to doom scroll and wallow. But I think the reason independent outlets like Wicked Problems are worth your time and support is because having a sensible conversation rather than engaging in social media primal screams, much as that can be therapeutic for a moment or two, this is probably better for your brain and definitely for your liver. So if you can, do help us out with a rating and review on Apple or Spotify, and here at wickedproblems.earth. If you can help support us, also we bring you these episodes ad-free. So come on in. Water's fine. So later on we'll have my interview with Liam Hardy from the Green Alliance, and as we unpack a lot of that, before giving you a few minutes of highlights from BP's 3-hour investor call. Don't worry, I'm not going to make you sit through the whole thing. I did, and it's going to take a while for that sting to leave. And unless I missed something, I don't believe the words climate ever pass anyone's lips in those 3 hours. But Gulf of America, that got a lot of airtime. So here's my conversation coming up with Charlie Mercer to kick us off.
Charlie Mercer, the old mucker, Policy Director at the Startup Coalition. Thank you for coming back on Wicked Problems, man.
My pleasure, mate. Thank you for having me.
And, well, it's 25th of February, 2025, and, woo! Things are a little weird.
It's just a little bit, aren't they? Yeah.
So, governments around the world are, like, sharpening their pencils, running the rule over various programs and departments. I saw today that they're going to cut the foreign aid budget, which seems like a cracking idea. Well done, guys. Before the Prime Minister goes to see the bad orange man in the White House later today, which I'm so excited about. But we're here to talk about the thing that people who subscribe to this feed want to hear more about, which of course is climate tech. And Startup Coalition is doing its best to make sure, both in an inside game and an outside game, that we don't go down the way of Elon Musk and Doge, of just basically taking a flamethrower to any bits of spending anywhere, with making sure to carefully prune only those things that would benefit the oligarch. So in our case, we would like to, if we're going to look at savings and efficiency, we want to do it in like a rational way. And, the industries of the future in this country require people to keep the commitments that they've made. So you've, spearheading an initiative with Startup Coalition to get people on board, to try to, make the argument to the Chancellor and to Ed Miliband that we should be making sure to commit to protecting the future of something called the Net Zero Innovation Portfolio. So first of all, what is that?
Yes, for sure. So this is actually a legacy of Mr. Boris Johnson. Remember him? Yeah. Years ago, a reminder that the chaos has been going on for a little while now. So back in 2020, before COP26 up in Glasgow, which obviously then delayed a year, the then Prime Minister announced a 10-point plan for a green industrial revolution. And one of those points was an aspiration for the UK to be the home of some of the innovative technologies of the future, i.e. climate technology that you and I spend our lives talking about. And since then, so over the last 4 and a bit years, the Net Zero Innovation Portfolio has invested £1.3 billion in climate innovation across the economy, in everything from whiskey distillery decarbonisation, which was the first one, which again maybe shows you some of the priorities of the then government, all the way through to...
I did not know that. Is that true?
There you go. It is. The Green Distilleries Programme was the first funded Net Zero Innovation Portfolio. Indeed. Well, and actually there have been some, so it obviously it's very funny.
Good for them. Good for them.
There were some superb climate techs funded through that. So the technologies that these climate techs were developing just so happened to decarbonize whiskey, right? So, and because of the peat content, it is actually something that's quite, is it the most important? Probably not. But it's also done direct air capture. It's supported with heat pump rollout, supported with EV charging connectivity. So a whole bunch of amazing technologies have been subsidized.
Right.
The government, however, hasn't done the best job of talking about, first of all, celebrating the success of it, but also giving us, some specific numbers around climate. So guarantee, grants that have gone to these firms. So to that end, we at Startup Coalition did our own analysis. So we farmed publicly available information, and of the 1.3 billion, about 200 million, and it may well be 200 to 300 million, has been given to climate technology firms, which is, a good amount of money. Could be higher, we think, seeing as it quite literally is a pot of money designed for these firms, it could be a little bit more. So, there's another question down the line about what NZIP 2.0 could do for climate technology firms. But in the first instance, as you correctly said, the government is embarking on a comprehensive spending review. They are looking at every penny of government spend for the first time since 2007. And that's Mr. Darren Jones, Chief Secretary to the Treasury, in Rachel's department. And over the next 4 months, and they've already been doing it for a couple, they are looking at every pound, every penny of government spend, where it's going to ensure it's spent in the best way to suit their missions, to suit value to the taxpayer. And of course, investing in climate technology should be part of that assessment. And that's why we think the NZIP is a really compelling, justification for further funds, particularly because if you look at the data that we found
you're saying basically that you're finding evidence that essentially that investment, particularly in climate tech, is, as they say, crowded in, private investment that to more than match, in fact, like 240, for every pound, invested in these companies by the government, essentially resulting in this much more of private investment coming in. Is that right?
That's correct, yeah. So the overall amount that the government has said is that the 1.3 billion has crowded in 600 million, whereas our evidence suggests that the 200 million, and this is, again, we're finessing it, right? So it might increase to 300 million. But that 208 million, which is the amount we think has gone to climate technology firms, has catalyzed 240% of that, right? So over 400 million has come in private investment. That's subsequent to the grants being given. And so these firms have raised billions of pounds separately, but after they've received NZIP funding, they have received 2.4 times the amount that they received through NZIP. So it's catalytic funding. You're absolutely right. It's de-risking the market. It's building markets. It's enticing investors to come in to put their, the money behind these firms. And therefore, one, that demonstrates value for money in the short term based on what we've already invested. But going forward, this is where, again, there's an opportunity to think about what NZIP 2.0 might do and put the money in the firms where you do see that return versus where you don't necessarily see as much.
So how can people lend their support if they're listening to this and they work in a climate tech business, or they're helping fund climate tech businesses, or they work in the policy space and understand the value of what these businesses might be able to produce? How can they help to lend their names to what you're trying to persuade the Chancellor at all of?
Yeah, for sure. So we're currently gaining signatures on open letter. So The goal is, as always, to build the evidence base, which is where we started, and we'll continue to build that out in the background. But building the coalition, so the clue is in the name of our organization, right? We build coalitions around issues. And the way in which we're crystallizing that is through an open letter to the government. We've got, I think we're approaching 150 founders and climate tech leaders who have signed up already, including some fantastic names. We'll be sharing that at some point soon. So if folks want to reach out, they're welcome to reach out to me directly, through LinkedIn, through my email and other ways. And also, check out Startup Coalition's website for all the work we've done previously in climate tech, and get involved through there.
Well, Charlie, we'll leave it there. Thank you so much for coming on the show, man. And we wish you luck with this.
It's very kind, Richard. See you again.
Take care.
Over half of the recessions since the 1970s have been caused by a fossil fuel crisis. This country can move beyond our dependence on volatile international fossil fuel markets and security risks that now come with them, which is another important consideration in a less predictable geopolitical age. We have grouped our suggestions for this carbon budget to government into 7 buckets. Make electricity cheaper. This is vital to enable a switch to efficient, low-carbon electric technologies across many sectors. Remove planning barriers. To reduce energy bills and improve our energy security, the UK's grid infrastructure needs improving, and the processes that can enable this need to speed up. Provide certainty. Timely decisions on new technologies and phase-out dates provides confidence to investors, businesses, and the public on what needs to happen next. Support households to install low-carbon heating, especially low-income households. And support businesses to decarbonise. UK businesses could take advantage of growing global demand for low-carbon goods and services. Grow the necessary workforces. Government, working with businesses, workers and communities, should proactively plan for how to enable this. And engage with the public. A strategy is needed that engages the public about the benefits of low-carbon choices with clear and trusted information.
Liam Hardy, Head of Research at Green Alliance, thank you so much for coming on Wicked Problems.
Yeah, good to be here. Thanks, Richard.
And Liam, you guys have put out like this super interesting paper on a topic that might seem esoteric to some people, but I think it touches so many things that are crucial in our politics and our economics and like where we go from here on climate, and that is the electrification of industry. So, Liam, first, can you tell us why was this paper necessary to come out right now?
It is actually quite timely because the big challenges that the government is facing now include very much the price of electricity, which is obviously a theme of that report and maybe what we'll discuss. But it's also exactly the right time to be trying to influence what the government's decisions might be on how it supports UK industries over the next few years and how it decarbonises the economy. And part of that is the industrial strategy, which it's obviously been consulting on and working towards publishing something in the next couple of months, but also the big spending review, which is how different government departments will be allocated funds or not over the next 3 years. And a big question for Department for Energy Security and Net Zero, but also the Department for Business and Trade and indeed others is, how do we support businesses to do the right thing and go down those effective paths to decarbonisation without breaking the bank? And I guess that no doubt will be a topic. But yeah, it's an important time to be trying to answer those questions.
And let's come to that, because again, so many of the things that we read in the business pages or you hear about in terms of how industry has been changing over the last decades, really, in this country, is that we have this drive towards decarbonization, which has kind of had this really impressive result. I was reading even like Robert Colville in the Times yesterday. We're recording on Monday the 24th, where kind of noting the fact that we've, in the UK, reduced emissions since 1990 by up to 50%, and that's been great. But the kind of flip side of that, according to critics, is that has come at the cost of industrial jobs here in the UK. We've offshored the manufacturing of things, and that has resulted in some big changes to the economy here. And most recently, we were seeing these really
kind of totemic battles when it comes to British Steel or it comes to Tata. It comes to like what happens to these heavy industries that require enormous amount of industrial heat that you could only previously get using oil or coal or natural gas. And moving these targets means if you can't do things electrically, then you wind up having to say, wait, I guess we're not going to do that here anymore. Is that kind of a fair way of summarizing kind of like the last 40 years of industrial history in the country?
To be honest, I think there's a little bit of a different story that the critics probably won't go into, which is, I mean, there's 100 different factors that affect why a business might move from one country to another or shut down in one place and something jumps up somewhere else. The changing nature of the things that we need and we produce and the labor market and everything. But it is very much true that the cost of energy has definitely played a role in that. I think it's a bit unfair to lump that all together and say that's the problem of climate action or net zero or decarbonization, mostly because at least in the last 12 months, the only really strong kind of policy driver that we have, I think, on industrial emissions is the emissions trading scheme. Right. The price for carbon credits in the UK's emissions trading scheme have been rock bottom for the last 12 months and pretty low for the last 2 years. There was a short period where they were higher, but before that they were relatively low as well. So sure, it will play a small factor, but I think there's many other factors at play. And of course, as I say, the main one is, I think, the cost of energy. And that's crucial because we need the cost of electricity to come down in order to decarbonize through electrification. But we also need the cost of other clean energy sources like clean hydrogen to come down as well. Otherwise, like you say, we will very much struggle to decarbonize those particular bits of heavy industry that really do need high temperatures. So whether that's primary steel making, certain parts of the chemical industry, cement making, those things need high temperatures. They have certain process emissions that are very difficult to avoid. And so things like clean hydrogen, things like carbon capture and storage certainly need to be on the table. And thankfully they are on the table and governments put plenty of support behind those. But they won't do all of it. And they might not be the best choice for some of those other industries, which actually could do very well under electrification. But at present, the price is too high to drive them in that direction.
Well, let's talk about that. Again, your paper lays out very clearly kind of besides decarbonization, which frankly in the current environment is less salient for a lot of people than perhaps some of the other aspects of the things you described. So the benefits of going electric as opposed to some of these other pathways, right, to do some of these manufacturing processes. Can you just maybe just touch on a couple of the benefits that you lay out in this paper about like why this is a pathway that needs more attention as opposed to some of these other things that we hear a lot about and attract seemingly limitless amounts of money, even in a cash-strapped environment. But the good old-fashioned, or not even old-fashioned, but sort of like, not as some reason, it just hasn't been as a story that's drawn as much attention. But on the electrification side, you guys lay out 8 particular advantages to pursuing the electrification path. What are they?
Sure, yeah. I think just a little bit of kind of why first, if you like, is the solutions that at least the UK government has backed, the previous and the current government have been backing in terms of clean hydrogen and carbon capture and storage. There's very much a kind of status quo industrial backing for those technologies because they are seen as relatively, for the industrial user, a relatively simple swap in, or we'll carry on doing what we've been doing, but we might use a slightly different fuel, or we might bolt on this carbon capture device, and then the rest of the problem is someone else's. And as long as the government pays for that bolt on or that extra cost of that fuel, I don't need to worry about it. So there's an appeal to that. And then there's obviously appeal to the companies that make profits out of continuing to use fossil fuels, say with carbon capture, or continuing to use fossil fuels and turn them into hydrogen. There's less of a kind of background momentum and support for an electrification transition. But very much so, like you say, we talked about a number of different benefits, one of which is simply the efficiency. So you gain so much efficiency when you use electricity directly to do many industrial processes. Compare that with, let's say you're generating steam for an industrial process and you're burning gas in a gas boiler. you might get up to sort of 80 or 90% energy efficiency conversion in that gas boiler. Similar if you use hydrogen. But if your hydrogen's, if it's come from fossil gas through carbon capture and then generated blue hydrogen, you've got an efficiency penalty there. If you've got green hydrogen from electricity, you've got a huge efficiency penalty there of 40, 50, 60%. So one of those is very much the efficiency. And even with carbon capture, you have an energy penalty of 20 to 40%. So even if all you do is electrify a direct heating and you don't talk about heat pumps, you've got an efficiency gain. But of course, if you introduce heat pumps to the equation, then you've got a huge efficiency boost there, potentially 2, 3, 4 times the efficiency. So that's number one for me anyway. It just makes sense, and the physics of it makes sense. Obviously, part of that is the emissions impact. And so if you're using clean electricity to drive your industrial process instead of fossil fuels, then you're very much reducing your emissions. With all forms of hydrogen and carbon capture, there's expected to be leakages and risks of not so much necessarily leakage, but emissions in that process, in the supply chain or in the
Well, let's just say there are more liabilities that are attached, right? I mean, it's something that, so when I mean, again, like listeners will know, but you will not, because we've not spoken before. Like back in the dim and distant, amongst the clients that I had would have been people in the oilfield services business who they had a whole division devoted to carbon capture and hydrogen and all this other stuff. But one of their big bugbears was the fact that regulation, made it very difficult to understand what the liability picture would be. Like, okay, we put this stuff into a salt cavern or whatever. What happens? Who's responsible? And then you see an accident like, I think it was Mississippi in the U.S. where I can't remember if it was a pipeline or if it was some other method of shipping, concentrated CO2, something broke. And suddenly this whole area in this town in Mississippi, suddenly the CO2 levels spike. And not only can you not, people have health effects, but you can't even operate emergency service vehicles to actually get to the source of the fire because they no longer work because there's too much CO2 in the air, which is mental. Yeah. So there are these other kind of consequences that come with that. And the other thing you talk about there is health. I was listening to someone else, the other show this morning, talk about people very rarely talk about the fact that from coal, oil, gas worldwide, 8 million deaths are attributable worldwide per year just to the particulates, to the other health effects from the emissions, never mind the climate stuff. So even if you're kind of just on board with clean air, which apparently even the new president of the United States is, then, 8 million people is not nothing. So healthier communities is another point you raise there. Anything else on the benefit side? Because I want to get to some of the barriers, because I think you do a really good job of kind of explaining some of those, and I want to talk those through. But anything else we're missing on the benefit side?
Yeah. I mean, just definitely worth highlighting that one of the key reasons why I think electrification is crucial, not just should be an option, but is crucial, is those many industrial sites which are not located in the industrial clusters that we expect to have access to carbon capture and clean hydrogen. Now, it's not impossible that they could put that, if they captured their carbon dioxide and put it in a tank and drove it over to one of those clusters, or similarly a tank bringing clean hydrogen from those clusters. That's not impossible, but it's sure going to be more expensive and logistically challenging and so on and so on. So the great thing about electrification is all of these sites very likely to already have some level of grid connection. Now they might well need upgrades or enhancements, but at least nearly all industrial sites are already connected to the grid. They might, as I say, they might need a bit more support, but the electricity is already there. We're already building out plenty of new clean electricity, so the grid's getting cleaner and cleaner all the time. So you can get on with these things now. You don't have to wait for that carbon capture and clean hydrogen infrastructure to be put in place, which is still going to take the best part of the next 5 to 10 years, even for those first clusters that we're developing. And you can do it everywhere. So around 50% of the emissions from the industrial sector in the UK are outside of the main industrial clusters. Not all of those clusters are getting carbon capture and hydrogen infrastructure anyway, and some of them will be much later down the line. So that's another benefit. Very much we can get on with it today, and we can do it. We can do it immediately and see those emissions reductions immediately.
Because I mean, whenever I hear about the hubs, right, and all credit to the mayor of Teesside and et cetera, but essentially there is this. I mean, again, the chancellor wants to get economic growth here in the UK, right, and you could lead that economic growth and lean it towards existing big industrial players, big energy players, et cetera. But if you are trying to encourage innovation in this, I don't know, Mittelstand, this kind of, or smaller even startups, without them having to be able to connect to these huge clusters where space is already kind of allocated, big industrial players are already there. If you want to encourage the industries of the future, having this more democratic kind of access to this stuff feels kind of important to be able to kind of level the playing field, make these other industrial processes for new companies, new types of industries come in there. So I just thought it was worth noting that before we move on to, I want to talk a little bit about the barriers to doing that. We talked about price, and that's, I think you cited a stat that I hadn't actually seen before, which is just really striking, which is that in the UK in 2023, I think that's right, in your study, that the cost per unit of energy to do things via electricity versus doing them via natural gas for certain industrial processes is about 4.6x. So it's 460% more expensive to do it via electricity than natural gas, which makes it sort of obvious why this has kind of taken a while for people to say, yeah, that seems like a good idea. Like, why would I pay nearly 5 times more to do the same thing? Kind of hard to make that case to your board.
Yeah.
So when we see it laid out that brazenly, but of course the other countries have done slightly differently, perhaps even slightly more favorably than the UK. So maybe you can tell us a little bit about this. I think you call it the spark gap.
Exactly, yeah. I think it's a bit of industry jargon there, but yeah, the spark gap is that ratio between the cost of a unit of energy through electricity versus through gas. And the UK has one of the highest spark gaps in Europe, certainly of our kind of major competitors in Germany, France, and Spain, and other places. So that's crucial, like you say. It's not quite as bad as the number suggests because of that efficiency gains that we were talking about earlier. So particularly if you use a heat pump to generate your steam and you get an efficiency of, say, 250%, then you're nearly there. You're not far off kind of cost parity in terms of generating that energy, but you're not quite there.
So I think sorry, just to interrupt, I think it's a super important point, because I missed that, right? Even going through the thing, because I think it's the other part of the equation. When people are, again, when there's a conference here in London last week, other places, people say, look at the amount of primary energy needed, blah, 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 if we do it this way versus the other way. But you have to look at the whole picture. Final energy versus primary energy, very different. We've talked about that on the show before, but the idea of if you only needed a third of the energy going in to accomplish the same task, then that just makes more sense. But it's seeing that as the whole that I think policymakers, lay people like me or other people, just sometimes find it hard to kind of keep all that in your head at the same time. So just kind of worth noting. But I think but also I think to your point, if you see your gas bill versus your electricity bill and you see the units you're going to do, and you're like, oh, that just seems like a lot.
Yeah.
That's kind of where a lot of people are stuck, right?
Exactly. But I think that's the point, is that if that spark gap could be reduced down to even 2.5, then you'd already see a lot of electrification opportunities being unlocked, particularly through heat pumps and those higher efficiency technologies. The lower you go with that spark gap, the more you unlock in terms of different industrial processes. In terms of a little bit about why that spark gap is so high in the UK, it's an interesting combination of the fact that actually the cost of gas in the UK is relatively low compared to in Europe for industrial consumers. I think that's a number of reasons, but partly we import a bunch of gas from the US, and then we take it in liquefied form, and we kind of turn that back into a gas and then pipe it over to Europe. So Europe's paying a little bit extra, or certain countries in Europe are paying a little bit extra as a result of that, whereas we don't. But one of the other things is that electricity in the UK is more expensive than in many of our neighboring countries in Europe because of something called the levies that we put on electricity bills. So when we pay for things like both renewable subsidies, but also to support fuel poor homes to be insulated, those levies only go on the electricity bill, or primarily go on the electricity bill. They don't go on the gas bill. Whereas other countries sometimes have that a little bit more even, or they don't put those levies on bills. They actually put them in the general taxation, which is much more progressive, and it doesn't hold back some of those transitions.
Because listener to the show will, before this episode comes out, we'll have put out an episode which takes some clips from this ARC conference last week, where some folks up on a stage in London at the Excel put up these graphs showing, the real cost of electricity has trebled in the UK per kilowatt hour, per megawatt hour than it did versus 20 years ago. And again, without explaining, that's where we've decided to put these levies. Look how expensive electricity is. And of course, without having the intellectual integrity to go, well, there's blah, 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 the reasons for that. But I guess that because we've had this policy mix going back 20 years and decided to level all these other costs onto ratepayers' bills, it feels like that's going to be kind of hard to unwind.
Yeah, for sure. It's a complex problem. And in effect, that answers the question of why haven't we done this sooner, on top of some of the sort of the conflicting interests of different parties, shall we say. But it's not easy. It's not easy to bring down the cost of electricity. We certainly would have done it by now if it was easy. But there are definitely options. So one is to reform the way those levies work. I hesitate to say definitively that we should switch them from electricity to gas, because although that would really bring down that spark gap by increasing the cost of gas and reducing the cost of electricity, some of the kind of second order or further effects are less clear. And certainly if you're a fuel poor household and you can't afford to electrify your home, and you're one of those few people left paying for your gas bills when everyone else who can afford to electrify has gone over to cheaper electricity, there's a real risk there. So it's not clear cut that that's the obvious answer, but that's one option. Another, as you say, is to talk about those levies and where they go, whether they could go into general taxation, which, as I say, tends to be more progressive. Some of those levies will come down. So many of them go towards kind of historic renewable subsidies that will be phasing out over the next couple of years. So those costs will come down. But other costs might arise. So as we decarbonize the electricity grid, there'll be more system costs or kind of grid management costs than we might have had under a system that was primarily gas and coal. So although the cost of the unit of the energy should come down as we see more and more renewables on the system and less gas, there might be higher system costs. So it's all a bit of a challenging mix, but I think there are things that can be done on the levies. There are things that can be done on the system costs. And for certain consumers, there are things that the government can do particularly to support those. So in terms of industry and industrial sites, places like Germany, for example, have what they call a carbon contract for difference, which is essentially the government will pay the difference or support the costs of the difference between doing your high carbon activity and doing it in a low carbon way. And that's a sort of technology neutral approach, which says if carbon capture is the best thing for you and your site, we'll pay for that. If hydrogen is the best thing for you and your site, we'll pay for that. But if it's electricity, we'll pay for that. So then you aren't forcing sites to choose what is it that the government is supporting most this month. They can actually have a look at all the different options, figure out what's best for them, what's going to be most economic for them, and go down that route. So that's one route that the government in Germany have taken. Another thing that's, I think, gaining quite a lot of popularity, but I still haven't wrapped my head around it entirely, and some colleagues are working a bit on this, but is whether there's ways for large consumers like industrial sites or a pool of fuel poor or people in fuel poverty to access the really cheap electricity directly from renewable generators before it goes into the whole energy market where it kind of gets brought up by the price of gas or the cost of gas-powered electricity, with something called a power purchase agreement, which is where, say, an industrial site signs a contract directly with a wind farm or a solar farm to purchase that electricity at low cost. Now, the one challenge for those businesses in the UK is you need to be able to sign and prove that you're going to be viable for 15 years to go onto a 15-year cheap contract with a solar farm or a wind farm. Many industrial businesses in the UK are struggling to say, yes, we'll definitely be around in 15 years' time. And actually, that's something, a role the government could play very well, is to underwrite some of those contracts, maybe bundle them together to say, well, we're pretty sure that a good number of these businesses will be around in 50 years' time. And if not, we, the government, will buy that energy regardless and make sure we sell it on to someone who needs it. So there will always be somebody there who needs that energy. Whether it's that particular site or that particular site is harder to know. So
I mean, I guess I'm glad you mentioned this because for me, like one of the things I love about living here is that as much as the finance sector has done some things that perhaps we wish they hadn't, here in the UK, like they have been super creative of being able to come up with applications and ways of distributing risk and distributing the cost, and actually just the level of innovation. Again, like sometimes it's terrifying, sometimes has terrible results, but at the same time, you wouldn't have the CFD regime that allowed a lot of the wind energy to get actually built, despite it being more expensive to do it offshore. Okay, I guess we'll do it that way, but how can we figure out a mechanism? And so the idea of taking a bunch of folks who, I was speaking to somebody at a conference, the Carbon Trust at a conference a couple weeks ago, where like this person's an academic. She lives in a house that it would be a flat, actually, that would be almost impossible for her to be able to afford to electrify heating. And the idea of shifting the levies, certainly all at once, certainly in her lifetime, from electricity to that would be kind of a real struggle for her in being able to just maintain her standard of living. And so I hear what you're saying, but the idea, like you take a ripple energy type approach, take all this aggregate demand, put it into some PPA, have the government underwrite that. These people are still going to be there in 15 years, unless, as opposed to a business that might go under. Like the people are still going to be around. And so the idea of like you can use that as a mechanism, I just think these things are like, they're not going to grab a sexy headline in the Telegraph or the Daily Mail, but damn, like that stuff is like super interesting about like how we actually move that forward. So I haven't had a chance to read the full longer version of your paper, but we'll put that link in the show notes as well, because I think there's so much interesting stuff that you guys are dealing with about how you skin this cat. There's just more than one way. And so getting in ideological kind of like corners and duking it out without thinking through where can we be creative. I think that's what's super interesting about what you guys are doing. But we talked a little bit about hydrogen CCS, and I think you've been very generous about that and very kind of like, even a lot of people I talked to were like pro-electrification or a little more blunt about saying like, guys, like this is just madness what we've been doing. 21 billion pounds to subsidize CCS that has never worked at scale anywhere in the world to actually abate this stuff, or hydrogen, which is just never, ever, ever, ever going to pencil out to work in terms of, never mind, you know, kind of like industrial heat, but certainly never for like power generation. What are we even talking about? Or aviation fuel or Christ, whatever else. But like I was a little more sanguine about this stuff a few years ago, and then you dig into the numbers, you talk to people, you're like, oh, why are we doing this again? I don't understand. And to your point in the paper, you know, we have thrown enormous amounts of money at this. And you see today, on the 24th, the Monday, the CBI putting out a paper saying, isn't it great? Green growth. We've got 10% of growth in green jobs and the renewable, like the clean power sector here in the UK and everything else. And like you look at the quotes and it's, you know, Ben Houshid, it's like these other guys talking about Teesside, talking about hydrogen clusters, talking about CCS. It's, oh boy, is that why we're stuck here? Is that why we can't talk about this openly? Because we have made these deals and we need to chalk up these wins to be able to say, look, see, we're moving in the right direction, but we're still joined at the hip with stuff that, again, maybe you can't say this, but other people, maybe I can say it more bluntly, which is basically, look, you look at this stuff, this is just not going to happen. It's a boondoggle, and yet we're not spending money in a cash-strapped environment that we should be spending to encourage these other pathways to electrification. Am I wrong?
Well, big one. I think look, I'm a real greenie, right? I really want us to solve the climate crisis for many, many important reasons, and I really don't trust the fossil fuel industry to do it, and I'm very skeptical of anything that they put forward. But looking into all the details and understanding as much as possible about the different industries that we have in the UK and elsewhere, there are some sectors that are really, really difficult to decarbonize without hydrogen and carbon capture. And so I really want those projects to work. I think we really need them to succeed, and we really need them to be functioning, to be cutting emissions, and to be affordable, and for those costs to be shared in the right way such that the right people pay them. And in my mind, that's the fossil fuel industry, not the government. But that doesn't mean I'm a flag waving fanatic for carbon capture and for hydrogen, because and definitely that those people exist, and they're wrong about what they think these things.
Well, let's take all that as read. Let's think we would love it. I would love to be in a world where we had the luxury to pursue all technology pathways equally. We had unlimited resources. But I guess my thing is, and I think you kind of allude to this in the paper, is that we've put all these chips over here on these couple of squares, right? And you've spent a lot of time in this paper highlighting these other things that we have failed to put resources into.
Yep.
And if we are in a situation where we have to make choices, I guess, is it not realistic, is it not reasonable to go back and revisit some of these decisions that say, should we really be putting scarce resources at this scale into things that many people are super skeptical about their ultimate scalability in terms of what other aspects of the things that we're going to be able to address? Whereas, like, you're describing some pathways that are kind of no regrets, to put it into some business jargon.
Yeah.
And yet we're kind of all nervous about, again, we don't want to just pee on someone else's solution for the sake of it. It's not an ideological thing, but it's like if we're starving resources from other things that we know are going to work, as opposed to, well, that might be nice if they do, but I'm not really sure. So how do we actually have that conversation about, like, how do you, this resource question in a world where we don't have unlimited resources?
Yeah. And that's the crux of what we're trying to say to some extent, which is, at the very, very least, these things need to be a level playing field and have shared support. If we think about, and don't quote me on this because I might be misremembering or they won't be super accurate, but my understanding is the teams within the government that work on carbon capture and hydrogen, they have hundreds of people in them. The teams that work on electrification of industrial processes are tiny. They haven't got those resources to develop these policies and tackle these problems.
Let's say we're going to quote you on this, but not hold you to the accuracy of particular numbers. But I think that it's fair to say that very few people would come back and question the overall truth of what you've just said, right? Which is that, and I think, again, it's not your scope, it's not the scope of this conversation to get into why that is. That's probably a conversation for a different day, and certainly over a pint sometime, Liam.
Yeah.
But I've kept you way over time compared to what I asked for. So, well, we'll put links in the show notes to this paper and to where they can read the fuller version of it. But any final thoughts before we let you go? I would love to talk more about grid, but we're already at 32 minutes into the conversation, and I've already got you saying things like, "Please don't quote me."
Yeah,
therefore,
of course,
we need to come back. We'll get you back some other time soon.
Sure. Yeah. But very happy to. I mean, just finally, there are other things that need to happen to unlock this electrification journey, and you mentioned grid. There's other sort of challenges with inertia within the industry that need help to overcome. And
so you say inertia in power industry, and like is that like just reluctance to move, or is that actual inertia in the system?
Sorry, yes, that's perhaps a bad choice of words. Yeah, reluctance to move, I think. I mean, because some of these technologies are relatively new, and although they might have been used in certain areas, less so in others, and people are familiar with their well-established technology. So there's that challenge. But yeah, overall, I mean, this unlocking this journey for industry. It expands across the economy in transport and heating and buildings. The key is lower electricity costs, and if you can bring that to the fore, then you can really unlock so much progress on emissions, on air pollution, on many things. But even then, that's not quite enough, and there's a few other things to hash out. So yeah, a real challenge for the government. But I think the government knows this problem and they care about it, and they're going to be. Or I very much hope they're going to be thinking through what they can offer as part of that industrial strategy this year.
Well, Liam Hardy, Head of Research at Green Alliance, thank you so much for coming on Wicked Problems. Again, we'll put some links in the show notes. If you can send us some more, we'll put those in as well. But I hope you'll come back soon. There's so much more we could have talked about today.
Absolutely. Thanks, Richard. Good to talk to you.
It's not been where we want it to be, and we are focused on relentlessly driving improvement. This is all in service of growing long-term shareholder value for you, our investors, which is at the core of the strategy we are presenting today. In 2020, we made some bold strategic changes, accelerating into the energy transition while progressively reducing our hydrocarbon business. We then saw COVID, the war in Ukraine, a recession, and a shift in attitudes of markets and governments have a fundamental impact on the energy system. Pressure on budgets meant that lower cost energy won out in most nations, and the pace of transition and decarbonization, while important, was not as fast as envisioned. And energy demand continues to rise. Our optimism for a fast transition was misplaced, and we went too far, too fast. Invest in your best assets and continue to grow them as you diversify into new business lines and remain flexible, moving at pace with society. Global carbon emissions need to be reduced, and as well as looking for more energy, countries, companies, and customers are looking for lower carbon products and services to support their own decarbonization objectives. The scale and pace of action over the past year is greater than anything I have seen over the past 20 years. The upstream is and will continue to be BP's primary cash-generating business. Our net zero operations aim is to be net zero across Scope 1 and 2 emissions within our operational control by 2050 or sooner. We are fundamentally resetting our strategy. We are reallocating capital to drive growth from our highest returning businesses, and we are focused on driving improved performance.
I've spoken before on why a strong, resilient balance sheet is important to BP, enabling us to manage the business through the commodity cycle.
In a world where energy demand is growing and changing, we build, grow, learn, adapt constantly. We're taking a new direction to reset BP. Reallocating capital for growth, reducing costs, and high-grading our portfolio, aiming to grow cash flow and returns. For over a century, we've grown, adapted, changed, and grown again. Yet one thing has always remained the same: delivering energy to the world, today and tomorrow. Because as an integrated energy company, we are uniquely positioned to win. A reset BP for today and tomorrow, growing long-term shareholder value.
If I rewind back to 5 years ago, there was a lot of optimism in the world, and there were a lot of priorities in the world that the energy transition became much more important. A lot has changed since then. We had COVID, we had a war, we had a material recession, and that impacted the ability of nations and corporations to afford these things.
We get the growing asset base on the oil and gas side. We like that. And then also, you know, the structure that William did around JERA, for example, we still have 50% offtake on that. So we're able to access these electrons and value chains, even as we change how we capitalise those businesses going forward.
Fantastic. Thank you, Carol. I can never get an answer to the question, Michele, on what to plan for the future. Assume in the future what we've delivered in the past is the best thing I think we can say, and Carol has a fabulous business that we're all enthusiastic about. I hope you enjoyed her unpacking it a bit more.
I firmly believe that over-distributing is not the right way to create shareholder value, let alone growing it. Now, on Iraq, I've been following the energy sector for more years than I want to say, and historically in Iraq has always been very difficult to produce money.
I think in 10 years' time, we'll look back on this as one of the most important transactions BP's done in 20 years. Yeah, so first, we've announced a $20 billion package. We're getting after it as fast as we can. I've already had texts on inbounds on Castrol, imagine that. I don't think there's any corporation inside our sector that does more exotic transactions than we do to drive value.
We're not doing PowerPoint anymore. We're in action. We've got engineers on the ground. We're cutting steel in these projects. It's the entrepreneurial adventurer spirit that I think and hope we still have inside our company.
If I go back the last 5 years, we kind of all understood what BP was about, right? So the integrated energy company, you could believe it or not, whatever, right? You know, I guess as you pivot back to oil and gas, you're now, you know, at a very competitive landscape for investor capital against all these other big integrated companies. So, what, you know, I guess I'm struggling to think of what BP's competitive position is relative to the industry.
And, you know, this is a good time to enter the company with share price suppressed. It's only upwards from here. And, you know, we're not done. We're absolutely not done. So quality of asset, quality of people, technology, trading, those are the fabulous things that we offer that not many in the sector can offer this high-graded a portfolio with this growth rate, with the extras on technology and trading that you'll hear.
So we are going to grow it to 650,000 barrels per day. It's not the biggest, but it's very, very high quality. Biggest is not always best. I like the quality of what we've got there.
Today marks the start of a new chapter for BP, building on our over 100-year history. I'm excited about it. We've fundamentally reset our strategy, laid out a new direction for BP, and are taking comprehensive action to grow long-term shareholder value. The people in this company are outstandingly capable, individually and as a team, players. They're problem solvers, they adapt to challenges, they adapt to change, they're committed to the success of the company.
Check it out now. I work the pen to make the ink transform on any particular surface the pen lands on. I care if it's hands-on. What's the beef? The coolie high code chiefs, high push techniques. I drape off poetic landscapes and shapes. Illustrate the paper space off the pens that paint. The design would have it National Geographic or magic with tailor-made status and plus flavor that's automatic.
We're now calling. We take it back to the days of yes, surely. We're holding on to what's golden.
If you liked this conversation, please share it and leave us a rating and review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. It really helps people find the show. If you'd like an ad-free version of this podcast, consider becoming a paid subscriber at wickedproblems.earth. You'll also get our newsletter, all our show notes, member-only goodies, and you'll be supporting media that wants to tell the stories at the frontier of climate tech, the place where people and politics, technology and capital meet and shape the future. And whether it's one you'd want to live in. Wicked Problems is written and edited by Richard Delavan. Production assistance was provided by me, Theodore Delavan. Wicked Problems, Climate Tech Conversations, is a production of Wicked Problems Limited. Thanks again for listening.
Game from close range, steady aim. A drum at your head to hit the brain. I'm labor ready, roll scholar for the dollar.
Well, if you're still here, I promised you, actually, at the beginning, there was mention of the Gulf of America. In case you have been hiding under a rock, you're perhaps aware that that has a name that the Trump administration has decided to christen the body of water between Mexico and the southern United States. Caused some stir. People think, this was kind of funny, I guess. This is one of the things that certain types of regimes do. They change the name of things and dare you to use the old one, because then you're showing that you're not on board with the new program. But if you really, really want to show that, you are on board, you will definitely use it. Don't be like the Associated Press. The media organization has been banned from the White House because of their decision to stick with their existing style book and call the body of water the Gulf of Mexico. That is the Gulf of Mexico. So anyway, but at this investor call yesterday, BP executives demonstrated that they're very keen to demonstrate that they're on board with the new script.
We've developed and deployed an AI wells assistant to the production environment in the Gulf of America.
As we increase production in our US onshore business and develop our enormous resource base in the Gulf of America, Thunder Horse in the Gulf of America, BP is a leader in seismic imaging. For example, in the Gulf of America, we've discovered 20 billion barrels of resources thanks to our leading ability to image the reservoir beneath salt. At Thunder Horse in the Gulf of America, innovative approaches such as managed pressure drilling is now being used across the Gulf of America.
We have made over 40 discoveries in the last decade, including recent successes in Trinidad, Egypt, and the Gulf of America.
It would appear that at least one executive, though, perhaps had other things on his mind, or just, I don't know, secretly wanted to signal that is Murray Auchincloss Canadian? Maybe he's a secret part of the resistance after all. Listen, catch up soon.
I'm struggling to think of what BP's competitive position is relative to the industry, or what's your strap line as you're trying to attract investor capital here?
So I'd start with one of the best upstreams around. Look at the Gulf of Mexico. Look at the lower 48 mix. Look at the Gulf of Mexico. Look at the Gulf of Mexico.
Well, that was fun. I hope that all was worth it. How did markets react, by the way? How did investors react to this new pitch and all the slavish devotion to the Gulf of America? Oh. Oh. That's a shame. Oh, and in case you're not watching the video of this, but just to listen to the audio, that is the Times from this morning. Headline,
BP Chief's big reset wipes nearly £1 billion off the shares. There you go. See you soon.
We take it back every day, so yes, y'all. We're holding on to what's golden.